The kamikaze was a physical attack on an enemy warship by an airplane with no consideration for survival. This unconventional attack had a huge impact on the world. In this video, we will discuss various information about the kamikaze special attack team from various perspectives. In this third video, we will discuss the kamikaze attack, which was an all-out effort in the Battle of Okinawa. With the Philippines and Iwo Jima almost under their control, the Allies set their next target on Okinawa. The Japanese also assumed that Okinawa would be the next enemy target. All of the Air Force's troops were sent on a suicide mission to destroy the enemy warships. This operation was called Operation Kikusui. On April 1, 1945, Allied forces landed in Okinawa. Admiral Richmond Turner's expeditionary force deployed around Okinawa had suffered heavy casualties and suicide attacks during the Battle of the Philippines. Therefore, radar picket ships equipped with radar were deployed to encompass the main fleet and transport fleet operating in the waters around Okinawa Island to set up an early warning system. Operation Kikusui was carried out in response to the landing of American troops in Okinawa. However, there were hardly any decent planes and skilled pilots left in the Japanese Army and Navy. The planes used for the operation were either old fighter planes or training planes used for pilot training. Most of the pilots on board were trainees or students. Under these poor conditions, Operation Kikusui was carried out. The operation was carried out until the end of June, when the Battle of Okinawa ended. The individual battles are omitted, but Operation Kikusui was launched a total of 10 times. A total of 940 Navy planes and 887 Army planes carried out suicide attacks, and 2,045 Navy and 1,022 Army personnel were killed in suicide attacks. And 133 of them hit enemy ships. 36 Allied ships were sunk, and 368 were heavily damaged and disabled. The number of casualties on board was significant, with 4,907 killed and 4,824 wounded. Most of the damage was caused by suicide attacks, the worst damage suffered in a single operation in the history of the U.S. Navy. The Allied damage was concentrated on the radar picket ships that were furthest out from the fleet. These ships were easy targets for suicide planes, which in turn protected the aircraft carriers and battleships that were inside the fleet. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, was concerned that Spruance, commander of the Fifth Fleet, and Mitcher, commander of the 58th Task Force, under his command, were under extreme strain due to the fierce battles they had been engaged in and were losing their commanding ability due to fatigue. He ordered Admiral William Halsey and Lieutenant General John S. McCain, Sr. to make an unusual change of command in the middle of the operation. Spruance later wrote in response to the suicide attacks in the Battle of Okinawa, "The suicide plane is a very effective weapon, and we can never underestimate it. I do not believe that anyone who has not been in this area of operations can understand the power it has over the fleet. When we were making our plans for Okinawa, no one thought that the Japanese suicide planes would pose such a great threat," he recalled. Seeing the tremendous damage, the U.S. military said, "The Battle of Okinawa proved that mass suicide attacks are extremely dangerous to seagoing vessels, even with inadequately trained pilots flying older aircraft." Even at the end of the war, it was clear that the Japanese Air Force had the capability to inflict serious damage by suicide attack on invading forces approaching the Japanese mainland. This was his assessment. The U.S. military had also analyzed that the number of ships sunk and destroyed by suicide planes would reach about 1,000 in the event of a decisive battle on the Japanese mainland. After Operation Kikusui, the Japanese military came to realize that suicide attacks were the only tactic that could be used against the American forces. They decided to fight a decisive battle on the mainland using suicide attacks as their main tactics. However, after the Soviet Union's entry into the war against Japan and the dropping of the atomic bomb in August, the Japanese leadership came to the conclusion that further continuation of the war was impossible. On August 15, 1945, Japan notified the Allies of its unconditional surrender, ending World War II. The sight of a suicide plane swooping down on its intended target, calmly and according to a prearranged plan, was a shock to American sailors. It created a panic among Allied soldiers in the Pacific theater. Thus, in addition to the physical effects of suicide attacks, such as the sinking and destruction of ships, they also caused tremendous human losses, such as a large number of casualties and mental illness, to Allied soldiers, mainly the U.S. Navy. Hundreds more Allied ships had been endangered by a single, deadly attack. Even if 100% of the Japanese aircraft and pilots had been lost, it would have been enough to inflict damage we could not withstand. This was his assessment. After the war, the U.S. military conducted a detailed investigation into suicide attacks. It interviewed 4 active duty officers who had graduated from the Naval Academy and 2 reserve naval flight students who had gone off to school to find out if they had volunteered for suicide attacks. The American military investigator asked, "Were suicide attacks forced or voluntary?" An active duty officer from a military academy said, "All were volunteers, but in the Philippines, depending on the war situation, there were times when entire units went on suicide missions. When we recruited in Japan, almost everyone was eager to join, and some students woke me up several times in the middle of the night to tell me that they wanted me to put them first. Also, when I excluded him from the list because he was my only son, I received a petition from his mother asking me to make him a member of a suicide mission." 2 Naval Flight Reserve students also replied, "As students, we could not be said to have mastered the military spirit, but as ordinary people, we were keenly aware of the war situation and believed that suicide attacks were the most effective way to attack. We volunteered because we believed that by dedicating ourselves to the cause, Japan would be victorious, and we hoped that our younger colleagues would be able to learn better." The investigator, who had initially said, "I can't imagine the idea of killing oneself for the sake of the nation or the emperor without taking any measures to return alive," finally said, "I understand a little more about the spiritual power of the suicide attackers. What you are saying makes sense, and I think the Americans can understand it." After interrogating a number of suicide squad commanders and survivors, the U.S. military concluded, "It is quite clear from the large amount of evidence and written statements obtained that the majority of Japanese pilots willingly volunteered for suicide air missions. The stories of pilots being strapped to aircraft would have occurred only once, if at all. It is also clear that by the last few weeks of the war, the most dedicated pilots were either exhausted or awaiting sorties. Both the Army and Navy had reached the point of assigning new and undertrained pilots to suicide units, i.e., recruiting volunteers." He also analyzed the fact that, despite the principle of the volunteer system, it had already reached its limit. As the U.S. military survey clearly shows, suicide attackers seem to have volunteered to carry out their missions. However, some of them may have been forced by the atmosphere around them to volunteer. Some may have been forced by their superiors to volunteer. In my next commentary, I would like to talk about the last letters of the suicide attackers to their families. If you enjoy it, please subscribe to my channel and click the like button.